everyone. Thank you for joining this roundtable session today focused on informal innovation. My name is Sian Summerton. I am based within the international team at the UK's Knowledge Transfer Network, and it's great to have you all join us today. So we're hoping that today's session will be highly interactive, so we're looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and all of your questions. If you'd like to raise a point or ask a question on YouTube, please do type it into the chat box, which you will see next to this video. Finally, as noted in the registration link, please note that this session is being recorded. So before we kick off with the presentations today, I'd just like to provide a bit of brief context and also thank our funders, including the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the Global Challenges Research Fund and Innovate UK. In country, we are also working very closely with the Technology and Innovation Agency and Shimalong Hub in South Africa, CC Hub in Nigeria, together with AfriLabs and iHub. So these are our key partners in the South Africa Global Alliance, in the Global Alliance Africa project. So against the backdrop of COVID, at KTN, we have recently conducted a rapid analysis of the innovation response in 23 countries around the world. Many of the challenges that surfaced through our rapid analysis can be traced back to structural gaps in the ecosystem that have made it very difficult for actors to find partners, investors, facilities, data, and a whole other myriad of other context-specific resources needed to facilitate the desired response. So as a result, we have put together this 3-week event series, of which we are now coming to the end of the second week. Its goal is to enhance innovative resilience in Africa through inclusive knowledge sharing, driving innovation through equitable partnerships, and ultimately looking at how we can build back stronger together. So our agenda today includes a series of presentations from Reciprocity, from UN Habitat and UCL. So thank you in advance to our fantastic panel of speakers. We're very much looking forward to hearing more. Following the presentations, we will move into a roundtable discussion facilitated by my colleague Emma McKenna. So please do make note of any questions that you would like to raise for our panelists at that point. In terms of the objectives of this particular session, we're hoping to unpack some of the challenges to engaging in the informal sector, especially in the context of COVID-19, and foster discussion on how to support inclusive approaches to transforming value chains. So on that note, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Pierre Kurtzer. So Pierre is the co-founder of Reciprocity, a Cape Town-based consultancy looking to unlock the potential of business as an agent of economic transformation and maximize the positive socio-economic footprint of business in low-income segments. Pierre has written multiple international reports researching and documenting innovative approaches to harness opportunities at the bottom of the pyramid. He has also designed programs for London Business School, Brown University, and the London School of Economics. Thank you so much, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Anne. You've done all the introductions, so I think that I'm not going to go very much into what Reciprocity does. You've presented some of that. I think that I just would like to emphasize one thing, which is that obviously the private sector has a huge role to play in supporting inclusive innovation and supporting innovation in emerging markets. It's probably true everywhere, but I think it's particularly true in emerging markets. And in the South African context, we are quite fortunate in some ways to have a fairly diversified and fairly strong private sector, perhaps more so than in many other emerging markets that are comparable. So it also comes with a lot of I suppose constraints and structural difficulties that have to do with our particular development trajectory, which is different from many other emerging markets, countries, I should say. South Africa has the history it has, which I think everybody is aware of. We've got a very painful past with structural inequality that's been artificially manufactured really through apartheid, and that obviously has massive consequences for us even today. I think I'd like to just briefly give the audience a little bit of background on the immediate context and how South Africa has been coping with COVID-19. I'm just going to quickly go through a few points there before I will look at some of the lessons in supporting innovation in informal markets such as we see them. So in South Africa, we've obviously gone through a terrible COVID crisis like everybody else around the globe. I think that looking around us about 6-7 months into this crisis, it's appearing quite sort of more and more clearly that we've had our experience of the COVID crisis has been perhaps slightly less awful than we had initially feared. And I realize I'm speaking in very relative terms here, and obviously one needs to be a little bit careful about how this is presented. But we were certainly extremely concerned at the beginning of this crisis back in February, March, when things were looking like we would be overwhelmed by an absolute horrifying death toll, and we were all extremely concerned that our healthcare system would not be able to cope, never mind our economy. It turns out a few months later, and of course we're not out of the woods yet, but we've actually had, comparatively speaking, a crisis that was not quite as bad as we had feared initially. Our caseload has been about 700,000 at this point in time. It's obviously still rising, but it's slowed down. We've had our sort of curve is about 2-3 months behind most of the global north. So we were at our peak somewhere in August, end of July, and the curve then went down very quickly. And the interesting thing is South Africa, as a number of, and as in fact most other African countries, had a very low death rate comparatively speaking to most northern countries. It's still unclear what the reason is for that, but obviously demographics might have to do with that. But we were certainly, quite relieved when it turns out that we had a relatively lower number of deaths than we initially feared. Unfortunately, that's just the sort of health aspect and the sanitary aspect. The economic carnage is absolutely real. We've lost as many jobs in 6 months as we created in the past 10 years. 2 million people have lost their jobs, and we already were, before the crisis, one of the countries with the globe's worst rates of unemployment. Combining that with the worst inequality in the world, we obviously are facing something that is staggering in terms of the economic proportions, consequences. Again, there are nevertheless some signs of resilience. So we've seen interesting phenomena happen. One is that very quickly, several million South Africans temporarily remigrated to rural areas from the cities. Now, most have since come back, but this has been a very interesting phenomenon. People have been falling back on rural areas and basically living with relatives. They lost their jobs and have been supported by government aid packages. So there's 2 tiers to that. So the governments, like in South Africa, like many other governments around the world, have unlocked emergency funds. Here in South Africa, the program was worth the announcement by the government was about 500 billion rand, which is, I think, in pounds, somewhere around 25-30 billion pounds. I don't know if these numbers actually mean much. It's unclear how much of that money has been really dispersed. But the positive news is that the existing social security net that we do have in South Africa, that we've built up over the last 25 years, has been resilient and has been absolutely crucial in helping people to basically get through the sort of immediate impact of the crisis. It's also, so there have been some signs of resilience, and there is again, some signs of recovery, but it is early days, and certainly the long-term impact still needs to be, we don't know yet what the long-term impact is going to be. There certainly has been a very, very deep slowdown or in fact reduction of GDP, and this is extremely worrying. It has also created an opening for government, and this has been becoming more clear over the last few weeks, and this will have an impact in terms of technological developments as well. It's created an opening for government to accelerate reform of state-owned enterprises and the economy in general, even though the details of that are still fairly sketchy. Now, just in terms of what we have observed as reciprocity over the past few months, some interesting things in terms of the impact of COVID, but also before even that, some interesting sort of observations in terms of innovation in informal markets. So I don't know if I should get into some examples yet, Shanda. Do I still have enough time to mention a couple of examples? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just briefly mention 3 interesting innovations over the last sort of 6 months that we've seen, 6 months to a year. Some of it directly linked to COVID, and others that indirectly have been impacted by COVID, but started before that. So these are all ground up sort of grassroots startups and innovations that took place pretty much organically in South Africa's sort of townships and emerging markets. One of them is called Cloudy Deliveries. Now, Cloudy Deliveries was started by a few young entrepreneurs in the township of Langa, just outside of Cape Town, where I am, about 10 minutes a drive out of the city center of Cape Town. They realized that a lot of residents of Langa were needing deliveries, were needing to get their groceries delivered to their homes. And rather than using only technology, they used conventional methods like bicycles combined with technology, using WhatsApp ordering, but then delivering goods on bicycles in the township of Langa to local traders. And while this idea was initially meant to serve the local sort of a network of businesses, it very, very quickly was noticed by residents, including elderly and pensioners, who weren't keen to get out of their houses during the COVID lockdown, and then decided to use the service and pay R9 a delivery. R9 is about £0.50 to get their groceries delivered to their door. Now, I thought this was a really interesting example of innovation that involves a combination of good old conventional technology and using WhatsApp, so mobile phone technology to actually trigger the request and also make the payment. So that was a very interesting example. I can share the website of this startup, of course, to the audience later if needed. Food flow is another really interesting new venture. So this was an innovation that was actually started by a student, an MPhil student at the University of Cape Town's Business School, a lady called Ashley Noel. And this was an initiative born in response to the COVID-19 restaurant closures and hunger crisis. We know in South Africa there's been a really bad hunger crisis as a result of COVID, and a lot of small-scale farmers were unable to reach markets. And this initiative, Food Flow, enabled small-scale farmers and fishers to viably feed their local communities. So they've paid about 1.8 million rands in purchases, benefiting 400 farmers and fishers, and delivered to date more than 16,000 harvest bags to around 30 communities in the Western Cape. And the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo, all of which are provinces across the country. So this is really an interesting, different example of innovation and initiative that combines different technologies and different sort of sophistications of technology. And the last example I'd like to give is called Livestock Wealth, which is essentially asset management, so storing value in cattle and farm products. So some of you may know that in Southern Africa, cattle is a traditional store of wealth. Most of the nations in Southern Africa own cattle basically as a pension fund, and so it's very familiar. It's something that's been practiced over centuries across Southern Africa. To own cattle was the way to store wealth and pass on assets to the future generations. And one of the sort of young startup entrepreneurs in Johannesburg basically started this to combine that idea with modern technology, and opened up a way to purchase cows and cattle on farms as fractional value, and enabled people who live in urban areas to actually buy cattle on farms that they never necessarily meet. So you're a virtual owner of cattle, and essentially when your particular cow gets slaughtered or gets to be sold for meat, or actually gets stored, you get a return on investment as a result after X number of years. So these are three examples of interesting combinations of traditional, conventional ways of doing things and modern and sort of mobile technology. So I think in terms of lessons that we've observed over the last few months, I think that three or four things stand out for me. One is that technology, which has been extremely sort of promoted across the African continent as the sort of solution to everything, is somewhat overhyped. I think technology is very useful, but it definitely is not everything. And usually, as I've illustrated in these three examples, the most interesting innovations combine conventional things and old tech with new technology. So it's not just about having everything on an app or on a mobile phone, but it's actually combining old and new technology. And I think this is an interesting observation, at least certainly in the South African context. The second observation or lesson that I would like to share is that the ecosystem really is everything. Everything works or fails within a larger social, political, and economic context. So things like income levels obviously cannot be ignored, infrastructure, socioeconomic context, the demographic structures, the presence or absence of crime, local government, whether that is functional or not, and you cannot really find solutions outside of this context. And usually you find that the success stories around the African continent involve successful ecosystems. And I think that's a very important observation that hopefully I think other panelists may also have observed. I think the third observation is that all over the African continent, there are many opportunities. These opportunities are sometimes extremely clear, but there are some wicked problems, which mean that there's a need to change our approach and methodology. And one example, and I think I'll close off with this, is sanitation in South Africa. Now, sanitation is not unique, or the issue of sanitation and the lack of access to sanitation is not unique to South Africa, but it is so complex and so layered in complexities that are political, economic, technical. And I think that we need to, we've tried for 25 years to resolve sanitation issues in South Africa, and it really has not been done yet. I'd be very keen to listen to other of the panelists if anyone has got great examples of working solutions on that elsewhere. We like mapping approaches so that all stakeholders can be identified to avoid working in silos. And I think one of the issues is exactly that, is to one of the main lessons for me at least is that we will not resolve issues if we don't know who is actually involved in designing these solutions and who we're doing it for and with, because you can't do something for someone without that person or without that community. So I'll finish off with that. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. If so, I do apologize. And I'm happy to hand over the baton to Sean and the other panelists.
No problem. Thanks, Pierre. That was really, really interesting to hear all of your insights, a bit more about the situation in South Africa at the moment. And obviously, the examples that you shared as well were hugely relevant. So hope we can pick up on those in the Q&A. And I was also actually really interested to hear about the urban to rural migration. So hopefully that's something that we can touch on as well when we get to that part of the conversation. So I am now going to move on to introduce Umar. So Umar is the Director of the Regional Office for Africa at UN Habitat. He has more than 18 years of experience in land, natural resources, conflict resolution, urban development, regional cooperation and partnership. He previously worked as a coordinator of the Urban Legislation, Land and Governance branch within UN Habitat, working towards improving tenure security for the vulnerable. Umar has supported land reform processes in many African countries, and he has also worked within the EU framework as a land policy advisor. Thank you so much, Umar. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Jan. I mean, thanks for having me, and really appreciate to take part to this session on innovation. So as you mentioned it, I've been working on this regional for Africa for UN Habitat over the last 8 months, and we have been looking at the best way, of attending these challenges related to urbanization in Africa. And luckily or unluckily, we face COVID-19, which require, a new way of doing business, but also looking into the urban dimension, knowing that cities are most affected by this pandemic on various areas, social, economic, environmentally, and health speaking. So the perspective I'm bringing today is more our concrete work in Kenya. As you may know it as well, Kenya is facing the challenges of informal settlement. I mean, you heard about Kibera, Mathare. I think it was broadly well known, were problematic, where people have been working a lot. But what is important is the new dynamic, that emerged during this COVID period in the slums, with the mobilization and, and youth engagement for innovation to curb, to curb this expansion of the COVID-19, but also in terms of community mobilization. This youth has been demonstrated they can take care of their, neighborhood, and they are able as well to come up with thinking, but also kind of strong mobilization to work with international development partners like UN Habitat and others NGOs as well who have been working in informal settlement. So that the work that started early age of this COVID-19, yes. But what is important in terms of innovation as well, into looking at the aspect of data, how this use has been skilled, but also being able to collect data for the neighborhood to influence decision-making process in response to COVID context. So this is the purpose of my presentation that I call engagement of youth informal settlement during COVID-19 in Kenya. So to start with, let me give you just some background information and what are the different characteristics of informal settlement in Kenya. They are all known, by people, but just to recall again some principles that need to be taken into consideration in this period of response to COVID-19. So you have especially density, which is some issues, small area per capita, no green area, narrow and irregular street, access is problem as well. High population density with concentration, strength on infrastructure, access to basic service is an issue as well, water, sanitation. So we realize from the COVID-19 that there's a lot that needs to be done in this sector of water and sanitation in Africa, especially. And we work on the report with United Nations Economic Commission in June for cities and COVID-19 in Africa, but we realize that more than 100 million people in Africa have not still access to running water, pipe water, which is about, sub-Saharan Africa. Low facility to population ratio, congestion, education, health, public transport, all issues. Access to low income, access to income as well is an issue. Next slide, please. So, in the COVID context, household congestion, which is making difficult, the respect of social distancing, limited outdoor interaction, shared facility, because the ratio is too low, in terms of sharing, toilet, bathroom, but also mitigation approach on house washing has been promoted, so which call for more sustainable, livelihood system for people. So the next slide will show you really what this youth has been doing. As I mentioned in my introduction, I think so. Next slide, please. Yes, we see quite a very strong mobilization from the youth with the support of international organizations like UN Habitat. And on that, youth was able to establish, a number of hand-washing stations, in informal settlement, Kibera, Matere, even in Kilifi, in other counties in Nairobi. But what was good as well, the fact that this, this hand washing was run by youth by themselves and helping people, as you may see it in the picture. But for that, they went through some training, as usual. But also this was opportunity to promote some entrepreneurship, because I think so we have been distributing masks, and this mask was done by this youth community with the support of Victor Wanaima Foundation, which is one of these famous, soccer players in Kenya, now in Canada. He gave $20,000 to the youth entrepreneurs to start generating masks, and we did it. But overall, in terms of impact, I think we see a certain number of people, 2 million people having access, to those, hand washing, and I can say today, there is quite some impact, driven by this youth intervention in terms of limiting the spread of the disease. So we have been very concerned, when the disease reaches this kind of area like Matare and Kibera. But luckily, I think these youth have done a great job, and they have been supporting the prevention of gender violence, but also supporting children education. This is just in a nutshell, the overall, picture, what youth have done. But I want to focus on particular area, which is the data management and collection, which is the next, because we realized that, there was a million of interventions, in informal settlement. Yeah, just I'll come back to this one, but you can go to the next one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one. So we realized that there's a number of intervention not coordinated in informal settlement in Kenya. But at the same time, you don't have clear picture on the gaps. And even you can see some overlap, one NGOs, 2 NGOs or 3 NGOs working on the same area, provide the same services. And that's where the reflection happens. So how we can build a better coordination of intervention so that at least we can use efficiently, the limited resources we have for informal settlement. On that, UN Habitat has initiated with a youth group, in Matare and Kibera, a data collection, operation with the goal of strengthening cooperation, but also of identifying key gaps in terms of service delivery, in the informal settlement. And this is some parameters and assumptions we use at the beginning. What exists, what is and what exists, and what is the facility service located, what are the location, does it work, and how people can use them. And this will based on the collaborative process with slum resident and other, entities. And this went through as well some training of the youth category for many days on use of GPS, on use of maps and use of the different tools necessary for the data collection. And the next one will give you, the next slide will give you a scope of the work that this youth has been doing in terms of data collection. So it's about mapping location and condition of key facilities. It's about identifying development partners working in slums or in their activities, which is making easier the coordination. It was about identifying gaps, area of intervention by actor and informal settlement. And the approach consists in looking into different, informal settlement, Kibera, Matare, Kangware, and Kisumu as well. I already talked about engaged data collection volunteer. We hire almost over 70 youth engaged for 4 days to do the data collection in the example of Matare, and clean and data, and they proceed as well to the data analysis. From there we have the report. So I will share just some emerging, result from this exercise. So which has been treated because we are using this data to develop some policy brief to inform, high-level decision makers, in this process of interventions, informal settlement, knowing that we have the hygiene program that the government has established in Kenya, and informal settlement is on top of this program, and they need all this effort to be able to identify the right approach, but also what are the needs of communities in terms of supporting informal settlement. So on the result of this approach, next slide, please. Yes, I mean, we have all this conclusion from this exercise. Settlement in Nairobi have poor access to service and facilities than settlement in Kisumu, because there was possibility of doing some comparison between different, informal settlement in different counties. Kibera more in need than Matare as well, and Kangware. On this, you can see the scale of need, in particular informal settlement against others. And which aspect most affected? I mean, because I know that access to water and sanitary was key, and there was a solid waste management issue as well, and there was quite a classification on the need, from water to toilet and others, what's come first. And the next slide as well is give you another picture of the next slide. Yes, I mean, this is also some summary of the findings. So come back a bit. Yes, I mean, long-term planning, decongestion strategies are some, some conclusion from this study in terms of long-term action. So, which is related to really decongestioning and regeneration of the informal settlement based on population ratio and facilities. So it was about, sustainability of the intervention, but also we just realized that most slums don't lack facilities, example water. The reality is more about talk about reliability and consistencies in case challenge and main intervention area. So, I mean, these are some preliminary, findings, and I can share with you the full report after this exercise. But what are the lessons we take from this exercise, which is the next slide? So, I mean, we talk about, we realize that this was an opportunity for collaboration, because we see many youth coming together from different backgrounds and working together. But also we realize that for training and coalition of the group of Islam have come up with an umbrella, and there's quite a number of coalitions established by this youth group. And partnership and networking was key as well for the successful, carry of this exercise. But most importantly, training and capacity building as well was key, because this youth has well skilled now, and they can run by themselves and do the same activities without the assistance of others, development partner. And this is happening now because they are well organized and well structured, and now they're running, with different informal settlement on the same services. Next slide, please. For that to happen as well, I think it's necessary to empower people and let them take the lead on their development intervention. This was just a model of ownership of community by themselves and doing the job by themselves with the support of international communities. And now they can have the leverage to move forward. Every settlement community has unique and great potential that need to be measured and enhanced. It means that we shouldn't underestimate the capacity at the community level. We need to see how to really unlock this capacity. Is very important when we talk about, this kind of intervention, which is based on social fabric, social safe net, an opportunity to showcase their skill, talent, and gifting, because there was some challenges even between youth on particular area, and there was a lot of competition, which is emulate, a lot of innovation and engagement. So culture and dynamic have been used as some catalytic, and a catalytic element as well for this intervention. And the last slide as well is just, key element that we feel necessary to consider when we work with communities in informal settlement. One is about partnership. I mean, partnership, internal partnership, but external partnership, policy and regulation, and whatever we do is based on this framework already existing. Looking into infrastructure, and when it comes to infrastructure, it's about access, but also maintenance of this infrastructure. Investment, of course, is about money. But what is important here when it comes to investment, with little you can do a lot. We see big project, million and million project, informal settlement as a sector, development sector, it doesn't have the same result than what they achieve, during this 6 months of campaign for COVID-19, because we have a, commitment, but also, contribution in nature of communities by themselves. And lastly, and not least, skill training as well, which is very important for creating capacity. And this will open, it will open the door for vocational training, but also for job creation for this youth. I think those are some elements I want to share for you to show how youth are able to innovate based on this particular context. And there's a lot we can reflect on. And as mentioned, many of these results has inspired the government policy in terms of response to COVID-19 and even the recovery plan. And now we can see now youth and informal settlement upgrading are top of the agenda for the government of Kenya. Again, thank you very much, Sian, for giving me this opportunity. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uma. That was really interesting, and it was great to hear about the role of the community and young people in creating impact, and also positive impacts that are sustainable in the long term. And as well, it was interesting to hear that some of the data is actually feeding into policy making already. So hopefully we can touch on that when we get to the roundtable discussion shortly. But thank you again. I'm now going to move on to introduce Ben. So Ben is currently leading on the local production, local solutions theme of the FCDO's COVID Action Programme, which prioritises making local production systems more resilient in the long term. Ben is also a research fellow at University College London, working to address the global provision of assistive technology and disability awareness in low and middle income countries. So his research topics include prosthetics innovation and materials, market shaping strategies, distributed manufacture, digital fabrication, and the circular economy. So thank you so much for joining us again, Ben.
Thanks so much. Great. So so today I'm going to talk about COVID Action, which I'll introduce first, and the local production, local solutions theme, which I'll elaborate on. If we go to the next slide, please. Is that gone? Great. So COVID Action. So we're a consortium led by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, formerly known as DFID. And we're looking to build a technology and innovation pipeline to support the pandemic response and recovery. We have a few different themes. We had a previous theme which is finished on oxygen now, but the active themes we've got going on are on data to inform decision making, resilient health systems and what that can look like in the future, and local productions, local solutions, which I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. Great. So local productions, local solutions, in a nutshell, is looking to address the supply chain issues that have hit producers in local communities across the globe in different ways. And there's this additional issue of just demand for critical products that have arisen in these local communities at the same time. So a lot of this that we're talking about was PPE, sanitizer, but it's not just that. Different communities have had different products that they've had problems with imports just not happening anymore, and that has hit them in different ways across the value chain. What this really has done, is expose this rigid, inflexible state of production that's the case in many settings, and it demonstrates this need for local, resilient, flexible production systems, and that's what we're interested in nurturing in the long term. And we see COVID possibly as a driving force for that, to be addressing the new demands that have brought about, but also trying to localize some of the production that's historically been dependent on imports, but that the trust in those imports has fallen. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of our journey so far. I'll elaborate on some of these investments that we've been making, but we're looking to crowdsource and map innovative responses to deal with demand for just whatever the unavailable goods are for that specific community. We've had over 500 submissions so far across 3 rounds. We're just judging on the 3rd round now, and we've made our first 7 investments so far, with more to come. Particularly with this session, I wanted to pinpoint our methods for our round 3. Next slide, please. So with our round 3, we partnered with AfriLabs because we wanted to expand our outreach for the program into offline communities. The producers and innovators that we wouldn't have reached with our online media push. So we had 7 scouts from AfriLabs venture off into 7 different countries, looking for these offline, microscale, not always microscale, I have to say, innovators in the informal sector. We wanted to see what was going on, uncover and really understand better what was happening. And the outcome that we've got of that is 85 applications across these 7 focus countries that we had. And we hope that with that, it's seeing the potential that's around that it wasn't usually seen. So breaking these common grant cycles, opens up avenues to be helping these people in different ways. and just uncovering new methodologies for how we can impact communities better. Okay, so next slide, please. So throughout the throughout this process, during COVID and during our submissions coming in, we've just had these sort of two broad brush themes that we're interested in as they're emerging that make sense of what's happening and their approaches to how we could enhance local resilient production ecosystems into the long term. We see these as ways for innovation to occur across scales, not just at the top scales in factories, but also down at the micro scale on the informal scale as well. So these two approaches being circular economy and distributed manufacturing. So I'm going to dive into them a little bit. So next slide, please. So to focus in, just what's the problem with this traditional linear economy? This, this idea of take, make, dispose. We take resources from nature, we make products. I mean, more and more of these products have got built-in obsolescence. And when they break, we just chuck them away and buy a new one. And consumers are often okay with that, depending on where we are. Less and less so. But this consumerism can drive the economy, yes. But consumerism is quite a privileged model, really, and one that is forced upon those whose finances don't suit it. And also, we know that it's just driving nature to destruction. And if that production is going on elsewhere, like how much of that value is actually staying in Africa? Particularly in the communities at which people are paying for items. And we see that during COVID, this system is shown to be very fragile. Long supply chains have broken down, shipping stopped, imports stalled, production stalled. People don't get what they need or what they need to be able to make their products. New products can't be developed quickly, and broken products that they can't get replaced. So thinking about what would be better and more resilient to this current global context, but whatever comes next, and could this pandemic be the driving force for good in the long run? So we're interested in ecosystem building around circular economy. Pierre highlighted on this, on just this need for systems thinking as an approach to really making change happen. So circular economy. So circular economy, to us, it means looping around your materials and products and resources and trying to retain their value for the local community, reducing the need for brand new anything, and trying to not see waste as waste. But as a resource that could be used. And it can be applied to a lot of sectors and practices. For LPLS, we're interested in creating these circular economy ecosystems because we see there's potential for it to be self-sustainable and there to be healthy symbiotic relationships between ventures and consumers. So I'm going to unpick that a little bit. Next slide, please. So we're interested, in making use of what you have available. That's not a choice. That's not a choice in some contexts. But not just using what's available from different continents. I'm working with some different innovators on this. We're working with Safe Motherhood Alliance. Unfortunately, founder Muslima was going to speak today, actually. Unfortunately, he's had a loss in the family. I'll elaborate a little on Safe Motherhood Alliance, actually, just in a second. We are also working with Ghani in South Sudan. So they were, a small-scale producer who pivoted to making hand washing facilities using the traditional clay pot method, which they've attaching taps to, and civilian-grade masks from the local fabrics, and that is having good effect. So I'm moving on to the next slide, please. So so if we're using local materials, it means it's easier to design for the local context and engaging with the local consumers and actually looking at what they need rather than just assuming that there's this global consumer that's a generic, everybody needs the same thing. Absolutely not. Every context is different and our products need to be just as different to suit those different locations. I've got a strong interest, in prosthetics with our work at the Global Disability Innovation Hub, and we see, time and again, these devices that are designed for European cities, often donated, they go into Africa. Well, they just don't translate well to rural Africa. They're not designed for there, and therefore they don't work for there. And more, if design is actually happening on the ground with access to the users that are going to use the products, then those products will be better. They're just better products for what they're wanted for. So we're working with Zena in Nepal. They're doing fantastic work. Currently working on PPE, nasopharyngeal swabs. A lot of 3D printing and digital fabrication there, but they also, they make beehives BEIS for local producers with their laser cutting facilities, and that's one-off designs that specific community needs to fulfill a gap. And that's, we're really interested in this. Okay, so next slide, please. So obviously, locally made. Yeah, I mean, that's what we're talking about, obviously. But I have to say, it's striking what that term locally made means depending on where you are. For some places, people get excited about that. They're like, oh yeah, fabulous. It's locally made. I like that. In other places, people don't want to hear that. And this can be a real barrier to people who want to innovate in this space, innovate for their own community. And obviously, we'd like to change that. We're coming up to work with a mold maker for injection molding, actually connected to another grantee that we have that use scrap aluminium to make molds. But the quality is questioned, but without even knowing who it is, what it is questioned and compared to the Chinese imports. And we want to work on proving that doesn't need to be the case. So we're also working with South Africa. I mean, this was a great. South Africa are a large plastics packaging company, and they converted one of their machines to make a thicker plastic to make PPE gowns. But that was only one part of the puzzle. Now they rapidly responded by collaborating with the Juakali, who are cooperatives of skilled workers on the outskirts of Nairobi. In this case, hundreds of informal tailors. And by cooperatively working together like that, using skills, using very established plastics production, but using that, bottom period informal workers, they're producing great numbers, and they pivoted really quickly. And it's just such a great example of cross-sector thinking. And it shows, the informal part of the innovation. It doesn't have to be confined within its own boundaries. It can also be just a major part of the puzzle of producing something that's needed. So next slide, please. Next again. Yeah, thanks. So with local materials design and production, the resources and expertise are there. Can we go back? Sorry, I've gone too fast. Thanks. The resource and expertise are there to make repair much more achievable, and this is often a bit that's missed out of the puzzle. Repair means like longer product life, better value, and more jobs for both specialists and generalized skills. But often just designs don't facilitate it. They don't allow it. And why would distant producers who are in another continent care if something's repairable? It's not part of their revenue stream. To give an example that links to what Umar was talking about, I was in Kibera last year talking to wheelchair users about their repair habits in the community, and they actually do. They have to repair their devices. In fact, the vast majority of the product life is dependent on that informal repair of devices, but the designs aren't made for it. They don't make it easy, and often those repairs will therefore be inadequate. It will continue to deteriorate. But the design was better if it had that in mind. That doesn't have to be the way. Okay, and finally going on to local recycling. So recycling should really, it should be the final option. We're working with a number of people working in this area, Garbage in Value Out in Nigeria, who work on a franchise model for waste collection and injection molded products. They're working on face shields right now, looking at other product sets as more sustainable business opportunities in the future. But yes, we're interested in closing the loop on local production. And like these ones I'm talking about today are not one ecosystem, they're in different places. But through the understanding of these, and we're now aiming to build upon each of these locations where we can and create links between different ventures as we build up our portfolio of people that we work with. I wanted to come back to and just highlight some of the work of Safe Motherhood Alliance that we're working on. So next slide, please. So we're working with Safe Motherhood Alliance in Zambia, and they develop a range of products aimed at mothers and women. Next slide, please. So this global problem of mothers giving birth at home, this is the global problem of mothers giving birth at home, just with little or no trained support or appropriate equipment to keep them safe. And in Zambia, 62% of women give birth at home, and that number's likely increased during COVID. And it brings with it increased vulnerability to virus and an increased reluctance or inability to access medical care. And it's not just during the birth. Even if all goes well, the bleeding that naturally follows from the mothers requires correct provision. It does. And if no maternity pads are available for women, they're forced to make do with whatever they have, rags, blankets, which leaves them open to infection. And it's a risk to others as well. And yeah, so Safe Motherhood Alliance have been working on this problem. Next slide, please. Sorry. So they've innovated to combat these severe shortages. Instead of the high cost of sterile products that are imported, they've started to manufacture these biodegradable sanitary pads made from banana tree trunk fiber that they've reversed engineered. And these, they've transformed this waste material into a sterile product that can be used by women in the communities that they work with in Zambia. So that's one of the products they do. And these maternity pads, they go into the baby delivery kits that they produce and distribute as well. That has a range of products that are needed for pregnant women in various communities. And during COVID, they've also started to print PPE to go into these kits to protect both the birth attendants and the mothers from risk. This printing method, this allows, it means that you can be applying that production capacity to other products in the future. We're interested in working on developing umbilical cord clamps, for example. So more information, next slide, please. More information can be found on Muzalema and Safe Motherhood's work there. Great. So this next problem I wanted to highlight about sort of traditional manufacturing. So, manufacturing is often disconnected from consumers. We mentioned, supply chains are long and complex, stakeholders are siloed, and it's geared for top of the pyramid gains. And, during COVID, we've seen that this sudden new need for products will just production ecosystems struggle to respond. Next slide, please. One possible way through this as an option is distributed manufacturing. So distributed manufacturing is about utilizing technology and communications to localize production as close to the consumer as possible. A key part of this is digital fabrication. So we can share designs and expertise from anywhere in the world. And with this, we get economies of scale instead of just economies of scope. You can make a wide range of products with the equipment that you have. And we've seen this used globally, huge, like that's, producing a large, when accumulated, a large amount of PPE that's come out of this. I believe that these methods have a huge potential to democratize design and production. And it's about equalizing the playing field about who can innovate. You don't need to have a factory and a huge team to be able to be making something that's important for your community. Lots of innovation going on in this area. However, there are currently some barriers to that. I mean, import taxes across Africa are a huge barrier to digital fabrication, about 40% in lots of places. And we'll discuss that later. Next slide, please. But that's, digital tech, the new tech, that's one part of the puzzle. But what about everything else? I mean, we've seen innovators using a huge amount of different machinery, and across scales. Informal innovation in make spaces, small workshops at home with one piece of hobby kit, just with handmade equipment that has been key to the response for their community. But can we be applying the same networking to all of this as well? And that's what we are interested in doing. And, this is synergies, what the other panelists were speaking about, enabling collaboration. And that's what we want to do with our map of production that we're developing. Next slide, please. We want to be mapping and understanding what production is where. So designers, or whoever needs something made, can easily see how to do that, and they can design for it. Connect them with the various parts of the product, production that they need, be it metalwork, be it electronics, be it printing, be it sewing, be it clay pots, whatever is required for that product. And we want to build this source for the community. We're not the only ones trying to do this. We're also working with the Open Nowhere project, which has an aim to allow different mapping initiatives to cooperate more easily with an open common data standard below it. So next slide, please. And if you're interested in that, we're doing a call to producers at the moment. If you go to this site to register your interest, so customers and collaborators can be better connected with you. And we're also doing a call out for expert consultants who could help with various projects around the world if they are willing. This site innovation action that we're building on, it's all about building connections between multiple programs and sectors. And our aim with this is to build up these maps that can be cross-referenceable across different sectors, programs, whatever, to make sense of the local systems that are there that could be working together, could be synergizing together. And yeah, we're very interested in doing that. Okay, yeah. So next slide, please. And final thoughts, yeah. Building links between local ventures could very well enhance resilience. And even during times of crisis, there needs to be a long-term outlook on what's needed to be done. We've seen, producers are innovating rapidly all over the place, and this innovation and drive, there's such great potential for it to make changes in the future after COVID, and this potential should be nurtured and not lost to the ether and going back to the old system that we know there's such huge problems with and have been highlighted so much by COVID. Next slide, please. And yeah, there's some links there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben. That was really, really interesting in highlighting the importance of local production and building more sustainable ecosystems. And thank you as well for touching on the Safe Motherhood Alliance. That was really interesting. I am conscious of time, but we have around half an hour left. So we will launch into about 25 minutes of a panel discussion. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Emma McKenna. So Emma is a knowledge transfer manager for emerging technologies and industries, and she will be facilitating the roundtable discussion today. So thank you very much, Emma, and over to you.
Thank you, Shan. Thanks for the introduction. And hello to everyone that is watching today. And thanks very much again to all of our speakers. I find that so interesting, and actually kind of each of the different kind of lessons and the successes that have happened in each of the different kind of contexts that we worked in, actually really heartwarming. And I don't think we hear enough of those kind of good news stories that have been going on around the world in kind of light of what is a really, really tough time with the COVID-19 pandemic. So if anyone does have any questions in the audience, please do pop them into the comment box. Really keen to kind of have any thoughts that you might have around kind of any of the presentations that the speakers gave this afternoon. But I'm just going to get the ball rolling because I have actually taken so many notes during all of those presentations. And I think what's been really kind of quite clear and a really common thread that's kind of been pulled together by each of the presentations is, despite COVID-19 being a global challenge that we're all faced with, one of the really things that has been come through quite strong is actually this really kind of local response to the local challenges that have then developed as a result of COVID-19. And I just wanted to know, and this is kind of a question for each of you, and maybe we'll kind of pull on you first, Pierre, is what key relationships do you think need strengthening to continue to support the success of these mechanisms around kind of local response to local challenges? Oh, do you want to go first, Pierre?
Sorry, I was trying to get hold of that mute button. I think spontaneously, I think certainly in the Southern African or South African context, I think the relationship between government, the private sector and civil society needs to strengthen. I think there's a lot of stuff happening sort of in silos, and this has been a frustration for us. We've got this very dense number of stakeholders, and again, as I emphasized at the beginning of the of this conversation, in the South African case, we actually are fortunate to have a fairly dense and diversified private sector, and I think that a lot more could be done to strengthen the relationship between what needs to happen on the ground and what the private sector can do. I think if you speak to protagonists in the private sector in South Africa, there will probably be talk of how much they've already been trying and how frustrating it is to engage with government. I'm sure some of that's true, and I've got a lot of sympathy for that on a personal level, being, I suppose, in the private sector myself. But I do think that there needs to be more of a concerted conversation between the different sort of parts of the public sector and the private sector, and of course civil society. I'm speaking probably a little bit too generically, but I think that there's some really important things that need to happen, and one of the ways to do that is to actually create a proper platform for dialogue and actually decide collectively on where we want to see more action. I think there's definitely a need for that. That's my spontaneous response to the South African context. I don't know if that can be, if Umar or Ben have similar experiences in other parts of the world, but certainly from where I'm sitting, this is what I would like to see happen in terms of strengthening relationships.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really interested. And I think I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay, Umar, because I think kind of, you know, through your presentation, you talked a lot around kind of the importance of kind of the data that's being collected and the youth engagement, and then how this data then is being crowdsourced and then being able to use to inform decision making and to inform policy. So is there maybe particular lessons that we can learn there around the relationships between kind of civil society and government, and how we can build on that then as well? Are you there, Umar?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. I mean, I think this is a good analysis made by my colleague Pierre. Huh? I mean, so on these linkages, because that's always been a missing link, you know, the work of NGOs with the national and local government. And from my experience in the DRC, you know, in post-conflict, you may see a lot of time, you know, people working in a small corner of the world without any connection with policy and or institution already existing. So which was the missing link, which may submit, you know, expose your work into, you know, precarious because there's no sustainability. And as discussed, you know, by Pierre, I think in the example of South Africa, this linkage between local government and national government is very important. And even it has been, you know, key component of our engagement in informal settlement. So we have been working with Nairobi Metropolitan Services. We have been working with the Ministry of Housing to inform them and to brief them. Even the Minister of Health, at the end of the day, the Minister of Health was interested in the data as well to know what are the gaps in terms of, you know, health facilities. This is a critical point for me if you really want to have sustainability, how all this, you know, intervention or lesson learned can drive, you know, some change. I think at the end of the day, what we are doing are game changers that, you know, can be used for advocacy even by themselves. Now, you can see civil society, they have more voice in Kenya from the informal settlement, and people will listen to them. And we have more and more challenges involving, you know, these people from this informal settlement, even on public space. We have some challenges going on with UN Habitat, and they are really inspired and really emulated because of what they are seeing. But now on the policy level, I think some accompaniment measure, which is very important, as I mentioned in my presentation, the aspect of capacity is very important. So really gives them capacity so that they can make their point, being able to make a decision, but also see the right time, the right direction to take for term of advocacy. The last point, which was a strength as well, and what's come to civil society organization, being able to form coalitions, I think is very important. Where there are many, they can be really heavier than where they are going one by one or isolated or piecemeal approach. That's something we learn as well from this experience of influencing, you know, policy and other decision makers. Because when you have all these organizations from informal settlement going there, you know, may make sense that you know, the government will listen to them. And we had another experience as well in Matare, where GL10 has been supporting this community on tenure security regularization, for example. I mean, where the coalition of all this, you know, community, well organized, well structured. Now all this, you know, data was captured in the development plan, urban development plan in Matare. I think it was kind of a good example, you know, on this articulation or this linkages between top to bottom approach. You know, over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Some really kind of strong examples there. I think, you know, as you both say, finding the right platform to bring this to kind of together, and also providing those that, you know kind of their challenges better than anyone else, the opportunity to kind of put forward solutions and to provide that insight to those that are making the decisions. It's a really, really interesting approach, definitely. And Ben, did you have anything that maybe you wanted to add to that from your perspective with the projects that you've been leading on?
Yeah, so the question makes me mainly think about sort of our work. I work with my other FCDO program, Assistive Technology 2030. So with that, we're really looking at, you know, what the key problems in addressing what needs to be done is just initially just trying to understand the system as a whole, the system of stakeholders. We're working with the Clinton Health Access Initiative, who've got these ideas they bring from other areas on market shaping strategies, and it's you know, for assistive technology, we have this problem where there is this, it's a slightly chicken and egg scenario between supply and demand and the awareness of what's actually needed. There isn't the demand, it's perceived as if the demand is not there because persons with disabilities are not looking to access, they don't have an aware of even the potential for a service to be given to them. And because there's not that perceived demand, there isn't a supply. Investors won't invest in the area. Policymakers won't make policies based on nothing, you know, because that, you know, there's no data showing, you know, there's not a base data showing that there is a demand. There could be a demand, and you could be greatly impacting your people. And once you've tried to sort of map out this entire system of stakeholders and understanding where the blockages are, in this case, I'm talking about awareness, you know, awareness of what could be done, awareness of what people could receive, and what products could be developed, what markets could exist. You can start to see at what point you need to you need to begin that story, and often it does come down to policy. You know, if you can start, but if there isn't the data there in the first place to show and to prove to policymakers that something needs to change, then that's a hard sell. And that's, so, you know, data is something that comes first, and it, you know, echoes with what Umar had been talking about in his presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really important. You can't fix something that you don't know is kind of broken, and I think kind of having the evidence there to kind of back that up is definitely it's much needed. And I think we should be kind of data led rather than work based on assumptions. That way we can get much more effective solutions as well and progress. As part of your presentation, Ben, which I thought was really interesting, I'm a real geek for circular economy, so I really enjoyed it. But on one of the approaches you talked about kind of distributed manufacturing, and some of the barriers that you mentioned was around kind of tax imports. I was just wondering, you know, in practical terms, how have the barriers to the informal sector and informal innovation, have they changed in context of COVID, or are they just kind of things that have, you know, that are kind of structurally there? And have any ideas on how we might kind of overcome some of those as well?
Yeah, so the one that I did mention particularly is around, yeah, you know, I mentioned that there's this great potential for digital fabrication, which is, you know, it still has costs associated, but it really does open up at a certain scale people's ability to innovate, and we've seen people trying to do this across the world, across Africa, but the import taxes that are on this equipment, on 3D printers, on 3D printing filament, just the materials to even bring it in, are so high everywhere. You know, we're talking about 40%. I mean, you know, one of our partners, Royal Academy of Engineering, they had a COVID that really early on, they moved fast to seed 60 entrepreneurs across Africa with printing equipment, so they could start printing masks, shields, and they came up against this. I mean, their costs suddenly skyrocketed, and they were limited in what they were able to do. I mean, we've had similar problems we're trying to innovate in upper limb prosthetics in Uganda and Jordan, both locations. I mean, this was just a pilot project, a research pilot project, and we were seeing barriers just based on this import, on this import tax, and it's not protecting any domestic interest. You know, these things aren't made. These aren't made in country in Africa. And the only thing that structure is blocking is innovation. You're stopping people being able to innovate, and you're restricting innovation to be occurring only in large, well-resourced, large, you know, factories, R&D departments. when it could be different. And yeah, I think that policies that could nurture startups and small scale businesses need to be put in place, and encouraging people to be producing it in country and combat the imports that are coming in. And yeah, I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. Great to kind of hear kind of more details and a bit more of an overview around that. And I think policy can be a really useful instrument to help kind of promote innovation. But again, sometimes it can be a barrier. One of the other things that you had mentioned through your presentation, Pierre, was kind of around this kind of need for a successful ecosystem, or for a systems thinking approach, and the need for kind of all of the right kind of, I suppose, ingredients in terms of social, political, and economic to kind of to work quite well, and that can't be ignored. The one thing that I did think was kind of missing from that little trio was kind of environmental sustainability. And I know that we're kind of today talking about COVID-19 and kind of resilience in informal innovation, but climate change is not something we can kind of forget about. And kind of once we kind of perhaps get to the end of this pandemic, there is kind of something else that's looming over the horizon. And I just wonder, what kind of, I suppose, what's the role of COVID and climate change, and what's happening within South Africa in regards to that?
What's the role of COVID in environment?
The partnership, I suppose, between COVID and climate change, in terms of kind of the response to COVID, has that helped us prepare for climate change, or is there any lessons that we can learn from kind of this quick response in recovery?
Well, I'll take a different example that isn't directly linked to COVID, but is very relevant, and that is the Cape Town. I think all of you have probably heard of the fact that we were very close to having no water 2 years ago in Cape Town, and we had a massive water crisis, and I want to link that to sanitation. So when you talk about climate change, of course, as a result of much, much worse droughts than we ever had before, Cape Town almost ran out of water completely 2 years ago. And it was a wake-up call for all of us to, one, reduce demand for water, but also think about ways of saving water differently. And so we're the only city in the world, really, anywhere, not Australia, no developed country has managed to do this, to basically cut in half our water consumption by a mix of pressure on ourselves, and basically we just learned to use a lot less water. And this is directly linked to sanitation. So of course and this is an interesting example, because ideally we should not be flushing toilets with clean water at all. We should even not be flushing toilets with any water whatsoever. We should be using dry toilets, and that should become the norm all over the world. The problem is that we've obviously evolved to believe that using flush toilets is the so-called gold standard of toilets, and this is across the world. I'm pretty sure that Umar will confirm that if you ask somebody in Kibera, what would be the ideal solution, I may be mistaken, but I think that most people would say, if I could have any kind of sanitation solution, that would probably involve a flush toilet. Now we need to change that completely and stop that altogether. And obviously not just for people living in informal settlements, but for all of us. All of us should get used to waterless sanitation solutions. How that links up with COVID is a little bit, I think, different. Certainly, COVID has made us realize that a lot of things can be done differently, including mobility, of course. I mean, this is across the world, not just in South Africa, but the fact that we realize that we need to travel a lot less than we think we do, that we can use a lot less fuel, that we can use a lot less, that many of us can work remotely, don't need to commute as far as we think we should. This is not universally true, though. I think there's big limitations to that. But certainly, we've learned to use less stuff as a result of COVID. I think that this has definitely triggered new thinking around, how much our consumer model is sustainable, and it is obviously not sustainable. I think the debate in a country like South Africa is these things are being discussed sort of in the global north, and a lot of people find it very clear to say, well, you know, we should be having either zero growth or even negative growth, and that discussion is difficult to have in a context like South Africa, where 60% of the population basically still lives under the breadline, and obviously it's very difficult to tell people who have hardly got enough to eat that they should not be, you know, entitled to some economic growth. I think this is a discussion that is not an easy one. Having said that, I'm keen to see more thinking about how to combine sustainable economic growth for people who currently, I would say, are entitled to it. I am not entitled to economic growth, but my colleague Nolutanda, who lives in Langa, certainly should be able to get access to more growth, access to more sustainable growth. And I would love to see ways of combining the environmental imperative and the human need to see improved economic conditions in most parts of the world. And that dilemma, I think, is still a defining dilemma of the time. And COVID has made that even more clear today, I think, than it ever was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're dead right. You know, there's definitely a balance to be had in terms of there's still some that need to kind of have access to that growth, whereas the rest of it, you know, some of us need to slow down. And a really interesting model for that is, I think, Kate Raworth's donut economic theory, which is a really fantastic kind of approach and model and method for how we can kind of look at making sure that everyone has a basic access or, you know, standard of living, but not kind of going beyond our kind of ecological ceiling, which we've, you know, in some parts of the world, we've completely overshot. So definitely a very interesting approach. And it's kind of really interesting to see kind of, I suppose, how different local challenges has kind of made that kind of change in response or change in attitude. And I just kind of wanted to put the same question. Oh, sorry. Yes, go on ahead, Pierre.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing, is that, and I think Ben alluded to this earlier, is that one of the interesting impacts of COVID has been the shortening of supply chains. And we've seen how it was Sydney local is beautiful type of thing. And to a degree, it's a bit of a slogan, but on the other hand, we've seen how COVID has definitely managed, through also the examples that I've given, managed to reduce supply chains or shorten them, and that is definitely sustainable, or more sustainable than the long supply chains that we've had that are completely environmentally unsustainable and not probably even economically sustainable. So I think there's definitely opportunities that will hopefully, I'm hoping to see more of that, and these opportunities increase and have a bigger generalization of these short supply chains across the country and certainly across the continent.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. I think there's definitely a need for that kind of shorter and yeah, more resilient and then local as well value chains. And I just want to bring your Ben and Umar in to see if you wanted to kind of maybe add anything to the conversation around this as well.
No, I mean, I think this connection between climate change and this COVID is clear in the fact that, I think COVID has been, an aggravated factors, to aggravate, the situation. If you take, the example of informal settlement with these dire conditions, of livelihood and existence, very compact, without street, without access, without decent services. And also, most of the time, they are occupying kind of a very dangerous area where they are exposed to landslide. In the example of Kenya and other countries, so which means that they are vulnerable, on particular cases of climate change. When things happen, that's something, they're going to affect them directly. But at the same time, what we learn from climate change need now to look at the way that we are approaching, our cities and our informal settlement. So I'm happy that, in Nairobi, the government have been doing a lot of opening of streets to allow access, at least for security purposes for people. But at the same time, I think there's a system of circular economy that has been established, to curb these consequences of climate change and overall on the COVID-19. So we have labor-intensive work for people cleaning, this what you call this sewage, greening, the area, and they contribute a lot on greening on the area, but also on the recycling. I think they are getting now conscious on the role they should play, on protecting their area. And there's a lot of work on recycling. From there, probably they can see what can go, to get $1 additional or additional shilling, which create kind of circular economy, especially for women as well. And even something very important when we were discussing about the mask to be developed by the youth is that recyclable? Can we recycle this mask, or is they are biodegradable? Or as those are questions that people are asking themselves. It means that I think they are integrating this need of being more concerned about environmental protection and others. But on the broader sense, on the broader scale for UN Habitat, I think it's more about looking the way we are approaching planning. Of course, we need to look at this natural-based solution on planning and integrate the green in our planning system. And right now we have a process where we really map, all public space in Kenya, including the informal settlement, to see what are the gaps. And this mapping has been used by the government and environmental minister to be able to promote, this what we call this urban regeneration program. So I think those are some elements which are emerging. Where people draw more conscious from this COVID-19 on different aspects, social, economic, and now environmental is speaking, because everybody is talking about resilience and green cities or green space. And even, you can go to some houses in the back of the yard, you will see now people start planting trees, which are good things that people are integrating now over.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it's, it kind of was one of the other, we had time to kind of go into it, was one of the other questions was kind of around, obviously there's a lot of work going on there around kind of mapping of kind of what exists, what's working, what's missing, how it's being used within Kenya and the areas that you're working within. And it's great to kind of see that being layered over into kind of other facilities and kind of capabilities that exist. So is that kind of something that's going to be really kind of a focus kind of moving forward, that kind of crowd kind of youth engagement to help build up that local insight for identifying future opportunities? Umar.
Please, can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Yes, I was just saying that there's obviously there's a lot of work going on. You give a lot of great examples around kind of the mapping of facilities and capabilities. And is this kind of a really key tool then, or approach that's being used to identify, potential opportunities or where interventions need to happen around kind of informal innovation?
Yes, of course. Right now we are talking about even scaling up this work in different, more slums. And I think we have small money that we got from SIDA to scale up this money. And also this tool has been developed as a manual, this tool, Cobalt tool, we are using for this data collection and this manual. This is one element that we are working with the data team to really create kind of institutionalization of this process, nationally and locally speaking on scale up. And even right now, I think in others program of COVID that UN Habitat is developing in others country, now this urban profiling becomes systematic for us now, because you need to understand really the context where you are working and what are the different, changes that brought by COVID-19 need to be addressed. So now first things automatically that we need to do is urban profiling to see what are the status of the art. From there now you can see what interventions are needed, and this as well is guiding, even donors and others, intervention in the city. So those are some elements. On the technology side, of course, that's something. We intend to develop a manual. I think the manual is almost ready and can be disseminated. And now we are looking into a possibility of scaling up and developing more learning process, on this different tool and the methodology already existing on this data collection. Over.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's great. I'm really, really interested. It's a really interesting approach, and kind of great to see that being deployed and scaled up. Just one final question then for you, Ben, if that's okay, before we close. I think it was really interesting, kind of your note around kind of, I suppose, the challenge around kind of repair within circular economy and circular economy innovation within the program, and how it's kind of very difficult because, you know, so many items aren't designed in that way. Do you think there's an opportunity moving forward around kind of, I suppose, kind of locals that communities and organizations that are kind of, you know, focused on repair of particular items, be able to kind of have almost like a feedback loop into kind of designers or manufacturers to kind of encourage better design or circular design?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes, and it's the piece of the puzzle that always it comes up like later, because it's just, again, you know, the repairable, you know, repairable designs don't exist because the repair services don't exist, but the repair services don't exist because the designs aren't repairable. So why would anyone there's nothing to train to specialize in terms of training, and yeah, if that can be encouraged in different ways, I think, you know, we're saying about, you know, the shortening of supply chains, this trust in long supply chains has been rocked. You know, it's not there. There's less trust in these imports. Now could be the time for local producers to start to try to compete with that market. And one way is about developing these, you know, this product service systems, rather than just thinking about the product itself. Think about the service that comes with that product. You know, the repair and the maintenance that can be done locally, and showing that is a model that can work. And that could compete. And as we were talking about, you know, when you're talking about climate change, you know, this is one of those models where I think that, you know, the climate change issue that is always, you know, that's what springs to mind when we think about circular economy. But, you know, really that has to be a secondary effect if it's going to get anywhere. Consumers, you know, in the West, yeah, okay, there might be there's some responsibility there if you've got enough money to think about climate change. But for consumers at the bottom of the pyramid, that's not where the responsibility lies. And even on business development, Pierre was saying these people deserve economic growth. They absolutely do. And you know, economic growth with a sustainable angle, that's very privileged as well. However, if business models that facilitate sustainability, they happen to be sustainable, you know, they happen to produce long product cycles, but mainly the point for the community is that there's better value. The product is better value because it starts to incorporate into a system. It creates, the products last longer, but also jobs. You know, this could create jobs, and then that, you know, it starts to nurture itself, and the system starts to build up. That model is proven, and people see that, and people see that could be done, and it can expand it out to other product sets. But it's trying to sort of keep that momentum, which we could do from COVID, I think.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely different business models that can support that. How can you work with kind of maybe these large global manufacturers to have more of a local presence, and work again with kind of local organizations and local businesses that can perhaps offer a different business model of, you know, perhaps not, you know, kind of selling items, but providing access to them. They maintain ownership, repair them. And so the local community can access what they need, perhaps at a lower cost, but also, as well as say, job creation and different types of models that could work. So yeah, I think that's really, really exciting. I just want to say thank you so much to all of the panel members for a great conversation there, and for all of your really interesting insights and answers. I'm going to pass you back to Shan now for the closing remarks and summary, but thank you very much from me.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone. That was great. So just to let you know, we have only a few sessions left in this event series, unfortunately. So tomorrow we will have a session at the same time, which is focused on multi-scalar linkages. We have a great panel of speakers lined up for that one, so we do urge you to join. Next week we'll have some country-specific fireside chats. So we have Kenya on Tuesday and South Africa on Wednesday, so you'll find the links to register for those in the chat box. And then we will be summarising our 3 weeks on the 29th of October at 9 o'clock in our summit. So again, please do register. I should also stress as well that our networking platform is open if you would like to book any one-to-one meetings. This can also be found in the chat box. It's called Meeting Mojo. Thank you again, everybody, for joining. It's been such a great session. Massive thanks to Umar, Pierre and Ben and Emma also. I've really enjoyed this afternoon, and I hope everybody else has too. Thank you.
Thank you.